My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened to me on November 3rd, 2023. I had spent most of my life chasing success, building a career in investment banking in Chicago. Numbers, statistics, and market trends were all that mattered to me. Faith was never something I outright rejected. I just never saw a reason to make time for it. My wife, Emily, would bring it up sometimes, saying we should start going to church with our daughter, Lily, but I always found an excuse. Life was too busy, work was too demanding, and in my mind, everything had a logical explanation. Until that night, I was driving home late after a client meeting, my mind cluttered with emails I needed to respond to and deals waiting for my signature. The roads were mostly empty, just the faint hum of streetlights flickering in the distance. 1 second, I was gripping the wheel, thinking about a stock merger, and the next, nothing. I don't remember losing control. I don't remember the impact. It all happened too fast. But somehow I was still aware. It was as if I had been pulled out of time itself. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized I wasn't anywhere. There was no light, no sound, no feeling of ground beneath my feet, just an overwhelming, endless void. Yet I wasn't alone. I felt something, a presence so powerful that every part of me knew I had no control here. And then, before me stood Jesus. Not the way I had imagined him in childhood stories or church paintings. He was real, undeniably real. His presence was overwhelming, not just in sight but in truth. His eyes, they held something I still can't fully describe. Sorrow, wisdom, urgency. He looked at me, and without hesitation, he spoke. Time is almost up. And the moment those words left his lips, my surroundings changed. I was no longer in the void. Instead, I was high above the earth, looking down at the world below. First, everything looked normal. The cities, the oceans, the mountains, they were all there, just as they should be. But then, I noticed something was off. The air itself felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. And then, without warning, it began. The ground trembled violently, as if something deep beneath the surface had awakened. Cracks spread like veins across the land, devouring streets and buildings whole. Skyscrapers, monuments, everything that once seemed strong, collapsed into nothing but dust. I watched as entire cities crumbled, their bright lights flickering out one by one. But it didn't stop there. Fires erupted everywhere. I saw homes, businesses, places where families once gathered, engulfed in flames. Smoke rose so thick it swallowed the sky, turning it into an endless stretch of black. People ran, screaming, desperately searching for safety, but there was nowhere left to go. I heard sirens wailing, alarms blaring, but they were quickly drowned out by the sound of explosions. The world I had known, the world I had trusted, was falling apart right in front of me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scene changed. I was no longer above the destruction. Instead, I was in a dimly lit underground room, somewhere hidden from the chaos above. Around a long table sat the most powerful men in the world. I recognized them instantly: Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un. And at the center of them all sat a man I never thought I'd see in this setting, David Carter, the current US president. Their faces were grim, their voices low. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could feel it. They weren't trying to stop the destruction. They were planning something far worse. First, everything seemed peaceful. The world looked as it always had. Cities bustling, cars moving along highways, people living their lives as if nothing was wrong. But then I saw it. The first tremors. The ground below began to shake violently. Cracks spread like veins across landscapes, swallowing streets and buildings whole. Skyscrapers wobbled before crashing into dust. Bridges snapped as if they were made of twigs. The destruction was swift, merciless. I could hear the screams of people running, trying to escape something far greater than they could comprehend. But somehow I knew this was only the beginning. The scene shifted again, and suddenly I was no longer just watching the destruction. I was in the middle of it. Fire consumed entire cities, thick smoke choking out the sky until all that remained was darkness. I heard sirens blaring, explosions ripping through the air. People screamed, their faces twisted with terror as they ran, searching for safety where there was none. It was chaos, pure, unrelenting chaos. And then I was somewhere else entirely. A dimly lit underground room. A war room. I looked around, and my stomach dropped. Seated at a long table were world leaders, people I instantly recognized. Politicians, military officials, powerful figures whose faces I had seen on television for years. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Maps and documents were spread before them, their faces unreadable. One man tapped his fingers against the table, his expression cold and calculating. Another nodded solemnly as a thick file was pushed toward him. But at the center of it all sat a man, eyes locked onto a large screen, his expression hardened. They weren't debating. They weren't arguing. They weren't trying to stop what was happening. They had already decided. I tried to move closer to see what they were looking at on the screen, but before I could, the vision changed again. I was outside now, standing in the middle of a vast, open sky, watching in horror as missiles launched into the night. They rose like streaks of fire, cutting through the darkness one after another. I felt my heart pound as I realized what was happening. This was it. The war had begun. Then, in an instant, the first explosion erupted. A city, an American city, was wiped from existence in the blink of an eye. The blast sent shockwaves tearing through everything in its path. Buildings disintegrated into nothing. Cars melted like wax. People, they didn't even have time to scream. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone. More missiles followed. More explosions. Retaliation came swiftly. Moscow, Beijing, London, New York. No one was safe. The world was burning, and it all happened so fast. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the earth itself reacted. As if the destruction of war had awoken something deep within, volcanoes erupted all at once, spewing fire and ash into the already darkened sky. The air became toxic, thick with poison that killed in hours. The ground cracked and split apart, swallowing entire cities into massive rifts. The oceans rose, swallowing coastlines. Wildfires consumed everything in their path, unstoppable and relentless. And through it all, I could still hear Jesus' voice beside me. "This is not a punishment," he said. "It is a consequence." I strained to see what was on the screen, but before I could make it out, the entire room fell silent. A voice, calm yet commanding, spoke words I'll never forget. "This is the final play." The moment the words were spoken, the vision shifted again. I was outside, staring at the night sky. At first, it was still eerily quiet compared to the chaos I had just witnessed. But then, streaks of fire shot through the air. Missiles. One after another, they launched, leaving trails of smoke behind them. I tried to see where they were headed, but before I could, the first explosion erupted. A city, A massive, thriving metropolis was wiped from existence in an instant. The force of the blast sent shockwaves rippling outward, flattening everything in its path. Buildings melted, cars twisted into unrecognizable scraps of metal. The very sky itself seemed to ignite. Then came the second explosion, then the third. I watched in horror as fire rained down across the world. Moscow, Beijing, London, New York. No one was safe. Millions perished in mere moments. Those who survived would soon wish they hadn't. And then, as if in response to the war, the earth itself began to fight back. The oceans roared, swallowing entire coastlines without warning. Massive earthquakes ripped through the continents, opening the ground beneath cities and pulling them into the abyss. Volcanoes erupted in unison, spewing molten fire into the already blackened sky. The air became thick with poison, suffocating those who managed to escape the initial destruction. Wildfires consumed what was left, leaving behind only ash. The entire planet was unraveling, and I knew this wasn't just war. This was something far worse. This was the end. As I stood there watching the world collapse, I felt a presence beside me. Jesus. His expression didn't change. There was no shock, no panic, only sorrow. "This is not a punishment," he said. "It is a consequence." His words cut through me. I wanted to deny it, to believe this was some kind of cruel nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. This had been set in motion long ago. The choices made, the deception planted, this was the result. Then, my surroundings shifted again. The destruction faded, and I found myself looking at something new. A city rebuilt, but not in the way you'd expect. There was no chaos, no fire, no war. The streets were clean, the buildings pristine, the people moving in perfect order. At first glance, it looked like peace. But I knew better. There was something wrong, something unnatural about the silence. No laughter, no conversations, just an eerie sense of control. I noticed people standing in long lines, their heads bowed. They were waiting for something. As I moved closer, I saw a small device pressed against their foreheads and hands. The moment it touched them, a faint glow appeared beneath their skin. It wasn't ink. It wasn't a scar. It was something deeper. Jesus stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the scene before us. "They cannot buy," he said. "They cannot sell. They cannot live without it." My chest tightened. I had heard of this before. Brief mentions in church sermons, conversations I had ignored. The mark of the beast. It wasn't just a prophecy anymore. It was happening. I watched in horror as the people who accepted the mark changed. It was subtle at first. Their posture straightened. Their movements became mechanical, almost synchronized. But then I saw their eyes. The light in them was gone. They weren't the same anymore. They had given up something far greater than their freedom. And those who refused, they were led away, some crying, some silent, their fate unknown. Then my vision shifted again, and I found myself in a massive hall where thousands of people stood in rapt attention. The energy in the room was overwhelming, a mix of desperation and devotion. At the center of the stage stood a man, bathed in light. I knew I had seen him before. He was the same figure I had seen in the sky. His presence was commanding, his voice smooth and reassuring. "The old world is gone," he declared, "but from its ashes we will build something new, something greater, together." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices merging into one deafening roar. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. "Is this the Antichrist?" He didn't answer. Instead, time seemed to accelerate, and I saw the world reshaping itself, not through healing, but through control. Nations had vanished. Governments had crumbled. There was no war anymore because there was no need for it. The world had already surrendered, not to a country, not to an army, but to him. The people worshipped him, trusted him, believed he was the answer to their suffering. And that was the most terrifying part. They had no idea what they had done. I felt my stomach turn as I watched the deception unfold. It was perfect, so convincing that even those who once held strong to their faith were beginning to waver. Then the sky changed again. A great light appeared, stretching across the heavens, brighter than the sun but without warmth. The people fell to their knees in the streets, tears streaming down their faces. They believed it was divine. I heard their cries of worship, their voices trembling with awe. But beside me, Jesus remained still. "It is not," he said. A voice echoed across the world, speaking in every language at once. It was powerful, undeniable, yet something about it felt wrong. "My children," it said, "the time has come. The suffering is over." Then, from within the light, a figure descended. Radiant, glorious, familiar. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. "Is that you?" He didn't answer, but deep inside I already knew. It wasn't. The people wept, raising their hands toward the false Messiah. They surrendered completely, believing that their salvation had arrived. But then I saw something else. A group of people different from the others. They stood firm. They did not kneel. They were the ones who had refused the mark. Their clothes were torn, their bodies bruised, but their eyes still held something the others had lost. Truth. The false Messiah turned toward them, its face twisting with what almost looked like sadness. "These," it said, "are those who reject the new kingdom. They do not wish for peace. They wish only to divide and destroy." The crowd murmured, their confusion turning to anger. The same people who had been weeping moments ago, praising this false savior, now looked upon the ones who refused to kneel with hatred in their eyes. "This," the figure continued, "cannot be allowed." And with a single command, the executions began. I watched in horror as the first person was dragged onto a raised platform. A woman, her hands bound, her face bruised, yet her expression was calm, unwavering. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath. Prayer. The moment the executioner raised his weapon, I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I had to see. And then it happened. One by one, they fell. The crowd cheered. They celebrated. These weren't soldiers, weren't criminals. They were ordinary people. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. And yet, to the world, they were now enemies. The last resistance to complete control. My chest tightened as I turned to Jesus, my voice barely a whisper. "Why are you showing me this?" His gaze met mine, filled with something deeper than sorrow, a weight beyond time itself. "Because you must remember," he said. "You must warn them." Before I could speak, everything around me began to collapse. The sounds of cheering, the cries of the condemned, the blinding light of the false Messiah. It all shattered like glass. I was falling, spiraling through darkness, the visions flashing before my eyes. The war, the destruction, the deception, the people who had given up everything in exchange for a lie, and the ones who stood firm, paying the ultimate price. Then, with a gasp, I woke up. I was back. The The sterile scent of a hospital filled my lungs, the rhythmic beeping of monitors echoing in my ears. My entire body ached, every nerve screaming in pain. I heard voices, doctors, nurses, murmuring in shock. "He's back. We lost him, but he's back." Someone touched my arm, checking my pulse. I turned my head slowly, my vision still blurred, and saw my wife, Emily, standing at my bedside, her face streaked with tears. She had been praying. Tears burned my own eyes as the weight of what I had just experienced hit me like a tidal wave. It was real. Every moment, every word, every vision. I knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. And yet, as I lay there, trying to find the words to explain what I had seen, a terrifying thought settled deep in my soul. No one would believe me, but that's why I have to share this. If you're watching this, it means you were meant to hear it. Please don't ignore the signs. Don't wait until it's too late. Jesus is coming back, but so is the deception. Stay strong. Stay awake. And if you haven't given your life to Christ yet, now is the time. Because I promise you, the end is closer than we think. If this story has touched you, consider subscribing for more testimonies like this one, and share this video to others who need to hear this story. God bless you all.